The ring fit inside a thimble case. Wren had discovered this by accident, turning the small velvet box over in her hands one evening when the light through the window had turned from gold to gray and she had run out of reasons to keep holding it. The case had belonged to her mother, plain, unadorned, meant for practical things. The ring, by contrast, was not practical at all. A single sapphire set in a band of old gold, too fine for her station and too meaningful for her composure. She wrapped it in a square of muslin, placed it inside the thimble case, and closed the lid with a soft click that sounded, to her own ears, like the end of something. She had written the letter first. 3 attempts lay crumpled beside the inkwell before she settled on a single line. She would not explain herself at length. Explanation implied negotiation, and she was not negotiating. The line read, "I return what was never formally mine to keep, and I wish you very well." She signed it with her full name, not the familiar Wren he had used in the garden at Lady Pemberton's, not the Miss Colby of drawing rooms, but Wren Eliza Colby, as if she were closing an account at the bank. She sanded the ink, folded the paper once, and sealed it with plain wax. No imprint. She had no family seal and would not borrow one. The ring and the letter went into separate packets. The ring she would send by the morning post, the letter she addressed and set beside it. 2 envelopes, both directed to His Grace, the Duke of Pelmore, Pelmore House, Mayfair, London. She placed them on the hall table near the door, where Marian would not see them until morning, and then she went back to her sitting room, picked up her book, and read 3 pages without absorbing a single word. She was not heartbroken. She wished to be clear about this, if only to herself. Heartbreak implied surprise, and nothing about the Duke of Pelmore's failure to declare himself had surprised her. He had been attentive, more than attentive. He had sought her out at every assembly during the bath season, had walked with her along the Crescent when the weather was fine, had sent her a volume of Cowper's poems with a passage marked in pencil that she had read so many times the page had softened under her thumb. He had looked at her across crowded rooms with an expression that made other women glance between them and whisper. He had done everything, in fact, except the one thing that mattered. He had not spoken. And because he had not spoken, others had. The whispers had started gently, how fortunate Miss Colby was, how the Duke seemed quite taken, how an announcement must surely be forthcoming. Then, when no announcement came, the whispers had changed their color. Poor Miss Colby. How awkward for her. Did she really imagine a Duke of Pelmore would formalize an attachment to a woman of no fortune and no connections? She must have misread his attentions. He was merely being kind. Men of his rank were often kind to women they had no intention of marrying. Marian had delivered this intelligence with the blunt efficiency of an older sister who believed kindness was a waste of time when clarity would serve better. She had sat across from Wren at the breakfast table, their modest lodgings in Queen Square, 2 rented rooms and a shared parlor, and laid out the situation as one might lay out accounts that did not balance. "You have been seen with him 9 times in public," Marian had said, counting on her fingers as though tallying household expenses. 9 times, Wren. Without a chaperone of rank, without a formal introduction from his family, without a single word spoken to me as your nearest relation. You know what that looks like. It looks like a man who enjoys my company. It looks like a man who is enjoying your company without any intention of paying for the privilege. And I do not mean money, I mean reputation. Yours is the one being spent." Wren had not argued. Marian was not wrong. The absence of a formal declaration had become, over the weeks, its own kind of statement. What Cormac Ashton, Duke of Pelmore, felt in her presence, and she believed he felt something, she was not a fool, was apparently insufficient to overcome whatever it was that held him silent. His rank, her lack of it, the opinions of his family, whom she had never met, the expectations of a world in which a duke married strategically, not because a woman with no fortune made him laugh in a way that loosened the knot he carried permanently between his shoulders. She had waited. She had waited with patience, and then with something harder than patience, with the growing awareness that she was arranging her days around the possibility of a man who might never arrive at the point. And so she had made the decision herself, not in anger, in clarity. The ring went into the Morning Post. The letter, by some quirk of timing, a misdirected mail coach, a delayed sorting office, would not arrive for 2 more days. At Pelmore House, the small parcel arrived on a silver tray carried by a footman who had no notion of what it contained. The Duke was in his study, reviewing correspondence from his steward at the country estate. Mr. Oakes had written regarding drainage on the lower fields, a matter that required attention before autumn. Cormac set aside the steward's letter and picked up the parcel. It was light. Addressed in a hand he recognized immediately, the careful, slightly leftward-leaning script that belonged to a woman who had been taught penmanship by a mother who could not afford a governess, but had insisted on good handwriting as a form of dignity. He unwrapped the muslin. The thimble case opened, and the sapphire ring caught the morning light through the tall study windows. He held it for a long moment, turning it between his fingers. No letter accompanied it, no explanation. He did not need one. He sat very still in his chair, the ring in his palm, and understood with a precision that felt like something tearing that he had done this. Not through cruelty, he was not a cruel man, but through the particular cowardice of a man who had convinced himself that hesitation was the same as caution, that waiting was the same as wisdom, that a woman who had never once demanded anything of him would continue to wait simply because she had not yet stopped. She had stopped. He called for his horse within the quarter hour. His valet, who had been laying out clothes for an afternoon session at the House of Lords, a debate on poor relief that Cormac had been meaning to attend, watched as the Duke changed into riding boots and a heavier coat without explanation. Lord Sefton, who had been expected for luncheon, was sent a note of apology so brief it contained only 3 words and a signature. The groom who brought his horse around remarked afterwards in the kitchen that His Grace had looked like a man who had received news of a death, though no one in the household had died. The road from London to Bath was not short. A man on horseback, riding hard and changing mounts, could make it in a day if the weather held and he did not stop for more than water and a fresh horse. Cormac did not stop. He rode through the long afternoon and into the evening, through countryside that softened from the hard edges of the city into the rolling green of the western counties. And he thought about what he would say when he arrived, and every version he assembled in his mind fell apart before it was complete, because every version began with a justification, and she had not asked him to justify himself. She had simply returned his ring and wished him well. The well was what undid him. He could have borne anger. Anger would have given him something to meet, something to push against. But I wish you very well was the language of a woman who had already finished grieving and moved on to the collecting of herself, and it left him with nothing to answer except the silence he had created. He arrived in Bath after dark. Queen Square was quiet, the windows of the lodging-houses lit with candles behind drawn curtains. He stood before the door of the house where he knew she lived. He had walked her to this door 3 times, had stood on this step and said good night with a formality that had felt each time like a door he was choosing not to open, and he knocked. It was Wren who answered. Marion was out, a supper engagement with a friend from their old parish in Dorset, and the single maid they shared had gone to bed early with a headache. Wren opened the door herself, holding a candle, and found the Duke of Pelmore standing on her doorstep in riding clothes, his hair disordered by wind, the ring in his bare hand. She did not speak. She looked at the ring, then at his face, and her expression, he would remember this for the rest of his life, was not surprise. It was something closer to resignation, as though she had known, even as she sealed the parcel, that the quiet ending she had arranged for herself would not be permitted to remain quiet. "You had better come in," she said. She led him to the parlor. It was a small room, nothing like the grand drawing rooms of the houses where they had met during the season. 2 chairs by the fireplace, a table with her book still open on it, a candle on the mantelpiece that threw warm light across plain walls. She did not offer him tea. She did not take his coat. She sat down in her chair, arranged her skirts with the precise economy of movement he had always noticed in her, and waited for him to speak. He sat in the chair opposite. The ring was still in his hand. He looked at it, then at her, and said the only true thing he had. "I have no speech prepared. I did not ask you to come. No. I did not ask you to come because I did not wish to have this conversation. The ring was sufficient. I had hoped you would understand that. I understood it perfectly. That is why I'm here." She studied him. The candle between them cast his face in half light, and she could see the dust of the road on his collar, the weariness around his eyes, the way he held the ring not carelessly, but with the grip of a man who was afraid of dropping something. He had ridden from London. She calculated the distance, the hours, the fact that the letter had not yet arrived, and understood that he had come on the evidence of the ring alone, without explanation, without context, without knowing whether she had returned it in sorrow or in anger, or in something colder than either. "Why did you not speak?" she asked. Not accusation, a question she genuinely wished answered. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular roughness of a man who was not accustomed to saying difficult things aloud rather than carrying them silently. "Because I was afraid that speaking would change what we had into something I could lose." She absorbed this. Outside, a carriage passed along the square, its wheels on the cobblestones marking the seconds. "You lost it by not speaking," she said. "Yes? You understand that?" "I rode 9 hours to tell you that I understand that." She looked away from him for the first time, toward the window where the curtain did not quite meet the frame, and a sliver of dark street was visible. He watched her profile in the candlelight, the line of her jaw, the careful set of her mouth, the way she held her hands folded in her lap as though she were physically holding herself together. And he understood that her composure was not indifference. It was the structure she had built to survive a disappointment she had seen coming and chosen to meet on her own terms. "My sister believes you never intended to make a formal offer," she said, still looking toward the window. "Your sister is wrong." "Then why did you not make one?" "Because making an offer to a woman of your position from a man of mine carries consequences I wanted to be certain you understood before I asked you to bear them. My mother would oppose it. My family would make their displeasure known. The tongue would talk, not for a season, for years. I wanted to protect you from that, and in trying to protect you, I left you exposed to something worse. The assumption that I was a fool." "Yes." She turned back to him. Her eyes were bright, but she did not weep. He had never seen her weep, not once in all their acquaintance, and he understood now that this was not because she did not feel things deeply, but because she had long ago decided that her feelings were her own business and not a performance for the benefit of others. "I am not a woman who requires protection from gossip," she said. "I am a woman of 26 with no fortune, no connections of consequence, and a sister who keeps our accounts with the rigor of a military quartermaster. I have survived the bath season on a dress allowance that would not cover your bootmaker's bill. I have been patronized by women who married for money and pitied by women who married for rank and envied by no one at all. Gossip is not the worst thing that can happen to a woman in my position, Your Grace. The worst thing is waiting for a man who will not say what he means." He set the ring on the table between them, not offering it, placing it. A fact, not a gesture. "I mean to marry you," he said, "not in a private understanding that can be whispered about and reinterpreted and denied. A formal declaration, made properly to your sister, with witnesses if you wish them, and an announcement in the papers, and my mother may say whatever she pleases about it because I will be saying it louder." She looked at the ring on the table. She did not pick it up. "You cannot propose marriage to me in my parlor at 10 o'clock at night, without my sister present, covered in road dust, and expect me to answer you before the candle burns down. I do not expect you to answer me tonight." "Good, because I will not." "When then?" "When I have had time to consider whether a man who took an entire season to find his courage deserves a woman who has had hers all along." He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything close to a smile on his face since he had arrived, and it changed him, softened the severity that rank and habit had built around his features, and showed her for just a moment the man who had marked a passage in Cowper and sent it to her without a note because he had trusted her to understand what it meant. "I will wait," he said. "You will wait at the inn on Milsom Street. You will not call on me tomorrow. You will send a card to my sister requesting a formal interview at her convenience. Her convenience, not yours. And you will present yourself properly, in clean clothes, with your intentions stated plainly." "And the ring?" "The ring stays on this table until I decide whether it belongs on my hand or in the post." He stood. He bowed, a proper bow, not the abbreviated nod he gave in ballrooms, but the full formal acknowledgement of a woman whose terms he was accepting. She did not rise. She watched him from her chair with an expression that was not forgiveness and not refusal, but something in between, the careful, clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had learned that hope was a luxury best indulged with caution. He left. She heard the front door close, and then the sound of his boots on the step, and then nothing. She sat in the parlor for a long time after he had gone. The ring glinted on the table where he had placed it. She did not touch it. She picked up her book, read one page, and then closed it and simply sat, watching the candle burn, thinking about the distance between what she had sent away and what had come back to find her. Marion returned at 11:30, smelling of candle smoke and cold air, and found Wren sitting exactly where she had left her, except that the ring that had been in the thimble case that morning was now sitting on the parlor table like a question that had not yet been answered. "What?" Marion said, setting down her gloves. "Is that doing here?" Wren told her. She told her everything, the posting of the ring, the arrival of the Duke, the conversation, the terms she had set. Marion listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Marion, and when Wren had finished, her sister sat down in the chair the Duke had occupied and looked at the ring with the expression of a woman recalculating sums she had previously considered settled. "He rode from London." "Yes." "Today." "Yes." "Without a letter. Without knowing why you returned it." The ring was reason enough, apparently. Marion was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the grudging precision of a woman conceding a point she had not wished to concede, "That is not the behavior of a man who never intended to make an offer. No. That is the behavior of a man who is an idiot. Also, yes. But a sincere one." Wren did not answer. She looked at the ring. Marion looked at her sister. 3 days, Marion said. Make him wait 3 days. If he is still in Bath on the 3rd day, still presentable, still saying the same thing he said tonight, then you may consider it." "I had already decided on 3 days." "Of course you had." The card arrived the following morning, addressed to Miss Marion Colby, in a hand that was less careful than Wren's but more decisive, the handwriting of a man accustomed to signing documents that altered the direction of estates and livelihoods. He requested the honor of a formal interview at Miss Marion Colby's earliest convenience regarding a matter of a personal nature concerning her sister. He signed it with his full title. Beneath the title, in smaller letters, he had added, "I will wait as long as is required." Marion read it twice, set it on the breakfast table, and said, "He has decent handwriting, at least." The 3 days passed. Wren did not see him. She had told him not to call, and he did not call. She walked along the Crescent as she always did, visited the lending library, wrote a letter to an old friend in Dorset, mended a hem on her second-best dress. She performed the ordinary rituals of her ordinary life with the meticulous attention of a woman who was aware that her ordinary life might be about to become something else entirely, and who wished to be certain she was choosing the change rather than being swept into it. On the first night, after Marion had gone to bed and the house had settled into its particular silence, the creak of the staircase, the distant sound of a watchman on the square, Wren sat at the small writing desk in her room and tried to set down, in plain terms, the reasons she should refuse him. She got as far as 3. He had been silent when speech was required. He had allowed her reputation to bear the cost of his indecision. He had assumed she would wait indefinitely, as though her patience were a natural resource that could not be depleted. These were serious failures. She wrote them out in her careful hand and studied them as one studies a column of figures that ought to add up to a particular sum. But when she set down the pen and read them back, she found that beneath each accusation lay the same uncomfortable truth, that she had known who he was from the beginning, had understood the weight he carried, and had chosen to wait not because she was naive, but because the thing between them, when it was present, was unlike anything she had experienced before or expected to experience again. This did not excuse him. It complicated her. On the 2nd day, she learned from Mrs. Cabot at the milliner's shop that the Duke of Pelmore had been seen at the pump room, walking alone, speaking to no one, looking, Mrs. Cabot's word, grave. On the same day, she received a brief note from Lord Sefton, whom she had met once at an assembly, and who was, she understood, the Duke's closest friend. The note said simply, "He has not slept. He will not leave Bath without your answer. I have known him 15 years, and I have never seen him like this." The note was not a plea. It was an observation offered by a man who understood that information, properly delivered, could accomplish what persuasion could not. That evening, Marion asked her, casually, over their supper of cold chicken and bread, whether she had made up her mind. Wren said she had not, which was a lie. She had made up her mind sometime in the early hours of the morning, lying in her narrow bed, listening to rain on the window, thinking about the passage he had marked in the cowpier, a passage about the surprise of finding in the middle of an ordinary life something that altered the shape of everything around it. She had made up her mind, but she would not act on it until the third day, because the decision deserved the full weight of the time she had demanded, and because she needed to know, needed to prove to herself, that she was capable of sitting with a yes for 2 full days without rushing toward it. On the morning of the third day, Marion sent a reply to the Duke's card. She invited him to call at 4 o'clock that afternoon. She specified that tea would be served, that she would be present throughout, and that the conversation would be conducted in the parlor with the door open. He arrived at 7 minutes before 4. Wren knew this because Marion, who was stationed by the window with her embroidery, announced it with the flat satisfaction of a woman who had expected punctuality and received something better. "He is early," Marion said. "Good." He was clean. He was properly dressed, not the riding clothes of his arrival, but a well-cut coat of dark blue superfine, a waistcoat of pale gray silk, his cravat tied with the careful precision of a man who understood that this was not a morning call, but a tribunal. He carried nothing except himself, and, Wren noticed, the ring, which was in his waistcoat pocket. She could see the faint outline of the thimble case against the fabric. Marion received him with a formality that bordered on the military. She indicated the chair. She poured the tea. She asked him precisely 2 questions: what his intentions were, and what provision he meant to make for her sister in the event of his death. He answered both with a directness that surprised even Marion, who had expected evasion, and received instead a man who laid out the terms of his offer as plainly as if he were presenting a bill before the House of Lords: the settlement, the jointure, the properties that would be placed in Wren's name, the income that would be hers regardless of circumstance. "And your mother?" Marion asked. "The Dowager Duchess. What is her position?" "Her position is that I should marry Lady Georgiana Holt, who has £30,000 and excellent connections and no conversation whatsoever. My position is that I intend to marry your sister, who has no fortune and the best conversation I have encountered in 31 years of living." Marion looked at Wren. Wren looked at the Duke. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen before, not the careful composure of their season together, not the raw urgency of the night he had arrived, but something quieter and more certain, the expression of a man who had spent 3 days in a city that was not his own, waiting for a woman who owed him nothing, and who had used those 3 days not to prepare arguments, but to sit with the understanding that she might say no, and that if she said no, it would be because he had earned it. "Your Grace," Wren said, "Miss Colby. I have considered your offer for 3 days. I want you to understand that these 3 days were not a performance. I was not testing you. I needed the time because the decision I am making is permanent, and I wished to be certain I was making it because I chose you, not because you finally chose me." He set his teacup down. His hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady. "And have you decided?" "I have." She held out her hand, not the gesture of a woman waiting to be kissed, but the practical, open-palmed indication of a woman who was asking for something specific. He understood. He reached into his waistcoat pocket, opened the thimble case, and placed the ring in her palm. She looked at it for a moment, the sapphire, the old gold, the weight of it familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, and then she put it on her own finger, herself, without waiting for him to do it. Marion, from her chair by the window, made a sound that might have been approval, or might have been the clearing of a throat, and said, "I shall write to the Dowager Duchess myself. She will want to know that her son's bride has at least one relation with sense." The announcement appeared in the papers within the week. The Dowager Duchess's response arrived by express from the country estate, a letter so cold it might have frosted the paper it was written on, predicting ruin, disgrace, and the deterioration of a bloodline that had been carefully maintained for 6 generations. Cormac read it aloud to Wren over breakfast at a hotel in Bath, where they were dining with Marion and Lord Sefton as chaperones. When he had finished, Wren took the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it beneath her saucer. "She has a vigorous prose style," Wren said. "I look forward to meeting her." They were married 6 weeks later in the chapel at Pelmore Park, with an assembly so small it would have scandalized the Ton if the Ton had been invited, which they had not. The morning had dawned clear and cold, the kind of October light that turned the stone of the chapel to pale gold and threw long shadows across the gravel drive where the carriages waited. Wren dressed in her room, the room that had been prepared for her by Mrs. Vane, with fresh flowers on the mantelpiece and new curtains at the windows, as though the house itself were trying to make a good impression. Her dress was ivory muslin with a high empire waist, simpler than fashion required for a duchess's wedding, but precisely right for a woman who had never pretended to be anything other than what she was. Marian fastened the buttons at the back and said nothing, which was Marian's version of tenderness. Marian stood beside her sister in the chapel. Lord Sefton stood beside the Duke. Mrs. Vane, the housekeeper at Pelmore, wept into a handkerchief she had ironed that morning for precisely this purpose. The Dowager Duchess was not present. She had sent a note declining the invitation on grounds of ill health, though her health, as everyone knew, was formidable. She would come around eventually, not because she was persuaded, but because the grandchild who arrived 18 months later had her late husband's eyes, and even the most determined disapproval cannot hold its shape in the presence of a child who reaches for your face and laughs. Mr. Oakes, the steward, reported to Wren on the household accounts within the first month of her arrival at Pelmore Park, and discovered, to his quiet satisfaction, that the new Duchess reviewed figures with the thoroughness of a woman who had once managed an entire household on an income that would not have covered the wine cellar at Pelmore. She did not interfere with his management. She asked questions, precise, informed, occasionally uncomfortable questions, and she listened to his answers with the attention of someone who understood that an estate was not a decoration, but a living thing that required tending. Within the year, the kitchen garden had doubled its output, the tenant cottages had new roofing, and the household accounts balanced to the penny for the first time in a decade. Mrs. Vane, who had served 3 duchesses and liked none of them, liked this one. She said so to Mr. Oakes over their evening tea, and Mr. Oakes, who was not a man given to sentiment, agreed. Marian visited twice yearly, once in spring and once at Christmas. She arrived each time with the same trunk, the same traveling dress, and the same expression of faintly astonished approval at the evidence that her younger sister had, against all reasonable expectation, landed on her feet. She and the Dowager Duchess, when they finally met at a family supper the second Christmas, regarded each other across the table with the wary respect of 2 women who recognized in each other the same unyielding commitment to managing things properly. They were not friends. They were something more durable, allies who had independently concluded that Cormac required supervision and that Wren was the one best equipped to provide it. The letter, the one she had written, the single line of explanation, arrived at Pelmore House in London 2 days after the Duke had already left for Bath. His secretary, unsure what to do with it, forwarded it to Pelmore Park, where it arrived 3 weeks after the wedding. Cormac found it among a stack of correspondence one afternoon in the library. He opened it, read the single line, "I return what was never formally mine to keep, and I wish you very well," and sat for a long moment with the paper in his hands. He put it in the top drawer of his desk. He did not tell Wren it had arrived. She found it herself, years later, when she was looking for a pen nib and opened the wrong drawer. The letter was there, unfolded, the crease lines softened from what she suspected was repeated reading. She closed the drawer without taking it. That evening at supper, she said, without preamble, "You kept my letter." He looked up from his plate. "Yes." "You have read it more than once." "Yes." "Why?" He considered this. Across the table, candlelight caught the sapphire on her finger, the ring that had traveled from his hand to hers, to the post, to his palm, to the parlor table, and back to her hand, where it had remained for 4 years now, through a wedding and a child, and the slow, sturdy construction of a life she had not dared to expect. "Because it reminds me of what I nearly lost through silence," he said, "and because it is the bravest thing anyone has ever done for me. I did not do it for you. I did it for myself. I know. That is what makes it brave." She held his gaze across the table. The candles burned between them, steady and warm, and the house around them, his house, her home, their life, settled into the quiet sounds of evening. The clock in the hall, the distant murmur of the nursery where their daughter was being settled for the night, the creak of old wood holding its shape against time. She smiled, not the careful, measured expression she had worn through a season of waiting, but the unguarded thing beneath it, the smile of a woman who had sent something away and watched it come back changed, and who had learned that the distance between departure and return is sometimes the exact width of a life. They arrive here, like letters delayed on an uncertain road, whenever they are ready.